let's contrast that with a professional type of legislature. In a professional legislature, it would meet most of the year. It would be a full-time job. Because it's a full-time job, you would pay people who do this a regular salary. You would, in fact, even give them money for expenses. Because if a legislator has to represent people back home, as well as wherever the state capital is, they're going to have transportation costs and office costs and things like that. It's a full-time job. As an example of this, let me present you with the state of New York. The state of New York has the largest legislative staff of any legislature in the country. Over 3,000 people work for the New York State Legislature. It is a full-time job. People are paid enough. When you guys find out how much the various state legislatures make, you'll go, wow, that is a decent paying job. You have to remember, of course, they have to maintain houses in 2 different places. But it still is a well-paying job. So between that amateur sort of situation and the professional, which one of these do you think fits California? The answer is California is a professional legislature. We did a series of changes in Prop 1A, passed in 1966, that gave us our sort of modern professional legislature that we have in California. So, for example, the number of legislative days that our legislature meets is met in, it depends on the year, because we have a 4-year pattern, not just a 2-year pattern. But we usually run out of legislative days either in August, September, November, or December, depending on the year. And before you think August and September, well, that's kind of early. Those are in the even-numbered years when those legislators are going to actually be leaving Sacramento to be campaigning anyway. So they really aren't losing out on any time they would have spent legislating. Before we passed Proposition 140, which in addition to term limits, had a massive cut to the staff budget for the state legislature. Our staff was the second largest staff behind New York's in 1988. It is now the 4th largest staff. However, if you look at those, numbers 1 through 4 are all really pretty big staffs, and there's a large drop to number 5. So California is in that handful of states that has the most, that is one of the most professional legislatures out there. How much? I told you I was going to tell you. So how much do we pay our state legislators? Well, since 1990, we passed another proposition in 1990, Prop 112, that said that pay for the legislature was going to be set by the California Citizens Compensation Commission. We've further restricted that in 2009. Prop 1F said that if there's a budget deficit, there is no raise for the legislators in that year. So let's see what the pay looks like, and a little bit of the history of these of the pay for state legislators here. So if we click on salaries, here are the salaries of our various sort of elected government officials. The governor makes the most. This is quite common across the states. The governor makes the most at nearly $210,000. Note that befitting his status as pretty much unimportant, the lieutenant governor makes the least of all, or ties for the least of all statewide elected executives. Because, quite honestly, there's not much for them to do. The Attorney General makes second most, as does the Superintendent of Public Instruction. The Speaker of the Assembly and the Senate President Pro Tem, the leaders of the chambers, make 132, less than all the statewide executives. Going down to average members of the state legislature make 114,000. Again, it's not bad. Let's see how those have changed over time. So we're comparing 114,877 to 110. There was a $4,000 pay raise. from last year to this year. The year before was $107, a $3,000 pay raise. The year before that, $104, another $3,000 pay raise. The year before that, $100, a $4,000 pay raise. So you can see they've actually been doing better even in recent years than keeping pace with inflation. Back only 5 years ago, they were making 97. Back in 2013, they were making 95. And we keep scrolling back, 90,000. This one's interesting. See how in 2011, 2012, they were making 95? It went down to 90,000. Well, let's keep scrolling back to see more of this. Legislators made 95 in 2009, but that had been reduced. They were making 116 before. So from 2008, the sort of peak, right before the crash for the Great Recession, they were making 116. You scroll back up, they are now making 100 and almost 15. So you might say that sounds like a lot of money, but compared to the money they used to make, it is the case that legislators are actually getting paid less in nominal dollars now in 2019 than they were in 2008. So the deprofessionalization of the California legislature does continue. But don't cry too many tears for them. In addition to that pay, they are also get a generous compensation package. So not only is there the salary, they get health care and benefits that are quite honestly better than almost all other jobs out there. Those benefits include a full pension after 20 years. They don't, of course, serve 20 years because of term limits, but that's a really good pension rate. While they're while the legislature is in session, which again, remember, is all the time, there's a per diem, which is sort of to say they get money just for being in Sacramento, to cover sort of the fact that they're in Sacramento. They get a car allowance, as well. Now, of course, we've made other restrictions. They can't make money from speakers' fees, but at the end of the day, it still adds up to a professional compensation package, even if it isn't quite what it used to be 10 years ago. So who are the people who serve in the legislature? The number one professions that you'll find in the state legislature are attorneys and people who wrote down their profession as businessman or businesswoman. Remember, you can write anything you want down for occupation. So people will write businessman as opposed to exterminator or other jobs when they own their own business. So they won't write plumber, they'll write businessman because they happen to own the plumbing business. They commonly have previous experience serving in government. We'll talk more about this when we talk about term limits, but there's been an increase in insiders and former staff, people who have contacts with the person who's retiring, and they get in on the ground floor when they retire. What do they look like? Historically, it's been a pretty white and male institution, like pretty much all other institutions in politics in the United States. There's been an increase in women and in racial minorities over the last 20 years in California. The most notable of these is Latinos. African Americans actually were fairly decently represented at or above their population share since the 60s, since those redistricting cases in the 60s. But Latinos were notably underrepresented until recently. They are still somewhat underrepresented in the state legislature, but it isn't as dramatic as it used to be. Women are still a minority. They are not really even close to being a majority in the California legislature. We actually just had earlier this year, by this year I mean 2019. You might be looking at this in 2020. We just had our first majority female state legislature, and it was Nevada, which kind of surprised a lot of people. I expected it to be Arizona first. Arizona has had a lot better inclusion of women in government than almost every other state. But there is this definite southwestern, west coast thing where women are more represented in government than in other states. That makes California's lack of ever having a female governor and lower female representation in the Senate and Assembly that much more glaring compared to our neighboring states. Compared to a bunch of other states in the U.S., we're a little above average. But compared to our neighbors, we are far behind on representation of women. Okay, how do we bring order out of the chaos that is 120 people, all of whom have, shall we say, delusions of grandeur? In the Senate, nominally, the Constitution provides that the Lieutenant Governor is the President of the Senate. But that means that's only voting to break a tie, and these things happen insanely rarely. So the current person who is the Lieutenant Governor is Eleni Kounalakis, but she doesn't actually do anything with respect to the Senate. The person who actually runs the Senate is the President pro tempore, usually called President pro tem. This is an actual member of the Senate, the person who actually has power to do things. They are the chair of the Rules Committee of the Senate, and we'll get back to this in a bit on the next set of slides. The person who has this role right now is Tony Atkins, a Democrat out of San Diego. There's, of course, majority and minority party leadership in the Senate. There are Democratic and Republican leaders. So even though Tony Atkins is the leader of the Democratic Party, there is a majority party leader that is basically her deputy who is helping her get things done. There are also non-members who can serve various roles, such as the chief clerk or the sergeant-at-arms or chaplain. In that respect, the assembly looks the same. Chief clerk, sergeant-at-arms, chaplain, all these jobs done by professionals they pay, not by legislators. There's still a majority and minority leader, just like the Senate had, to try to help corral their party and push what their party wants. Where it's different is we don't have a constitutional office just sort of put in charge of it for no particular reason, like Lieutenant Governor in the Senate. In the Assembly, they pick a speaker. The speaker is, like the President pro tem, a member of that chamber, in this case the Assembly. They make committee assignments and they help with committee fundraising. This person used to actually be considered second in power in the state to the governor, but this is weakened because of term limits. Your current speaker is Anthony Rendon, who's a Democrat from Lakewood, who's also, by the way, a Titan. So go Titans. If you were thinking, what can I do with a degree in political science? Well, you can become Speaker of the Assembly. Because he not only has an undergrad degree, he went and got a PhD in political science from UC Riverside before he went on. And he was actually a multi-time Titan. Not only did he go here, but he taught here as well in our department. So what's the difference between them? Between the Speaker and the President pro tem? Well, the big difference is not what powers they sort of nominally have, but in how they're able to use them. So they can pretty much do the same thing, assigning office space, recognizing members on the floor, appointing people to committees, appointing committee chairs, appointing conference committees. All of these things are powers they have. At the end of the day, these things are really important in really two ways. One, agenda control. They get to shape who is speaking when, what bills are being brought up now, and which ones aren't. That's a really important way in which you lead a legislature, is by setting the agenda. The other thing is setting up the arenas of conflict. By making committees, by stacking them this way or that, you can make it so your friends get on one committee, or you can punish your enemies by putting them on committees they don't want to be on. Also, you can make committees that are more likely to produce the legislation you want. And so this power the leaders have is very, very important. When we start talking about the next set of slides, we'll talk about how the two chambers are different in these. So the powers are the same, but how they're actually able to execute them is different between the two chambers.